Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Vaira. I'm excited to present my final project to you all this evening. I titled it Talking Trash, and I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean this very, very literally. So my project is a frequency analysis of organics recycling terms. For those of you that don't know, outside of the MPPA program, I work as a recycling program administrator in the public sector. So these are very real challenges and very real problems that we're working through right now. And my project is designed to help public sector recycling program managers. So I'll start tonight by introducing the problem. So the problem is methane. Methane is emitted from landfills as a result of burying organic materials in landfills. And I define organic material as any vegetative material. So that's, material that comes from your lawn, from grass clippings, branches, as well as material that comes from your food. So that's your kitchen scraps, your table scraps, any wasted food, as well as food soil paper. So what happens is when this material is buried inside a landfill, methane is generated. And this is a really big problem because methane is a driver of climate change. Methane is a more potent greenhouse gas, which means that it is more heat trapping than carbon. And notably, it is also short-lived, which means that it stays in the atmosphere for not very long, but during its time in the atmosphere, because of its heat trapping abilities, it does a really good job at heating the climate. So in the climate mitigation strategies, you can think about methane emission reductions as the low-hanging fruit. It's really bad. It's a really bad greenhouse gas, and we need to get it out of the atmosphere quickly. So what does that mean for waste and recycling program administrators? So many program administrators have started collecting more organic material to divert this from landfills and towards composting operations, as well as anaerobic digestion. This is a very large task, considering that the waste stream is made up about 30% organic material. In California, in many suburban and urban areas, we're lucky to have had curbside lawn debris collection for quite a long time. So many municipalities in California are moving to adding food scraps into this curbside collection already. That being said, program administrators can do as much as we can with making sure that the infrastructure exists for these programs. So that means making sure everyone has these carts, working with our fleet, making sure we have fleet and staff and drivers to drive around and collect this material, do all the routing. We also work at the contract level with the large facilities that are coming online to process this material, namely composting and anaerobic digestion, as I mentioned. But at the end of the day, this climate mitigation strategy to reduce methane emissions really hinges on public behavior change, which is very, very unique. So that leads into my research question is ultimately what us practitioners want to know is what is the most effective organics recycling collection program? That being said, that's too big of a question for this time period, this semester. So I really drilled down and I decided to look at what terms jurisdictions are using when they're communicating to the public about these new programs. I'm really curious about, this conversation that they're having with their community about these changes. And from my perspective as an administrator, I've really noticed that the waste and recycling industry, first off, is really technical and it's really jargony. And when I'm interacting with the public, sometimes they aren't they're not understanding the words that I'm using. Additionally, as we were rolling out our programs this last year in 2022, I'm going through all of our communication materials, our flyers, our website updates, any way we're getting the word out. And I'm looking and I'm like, okay, sometimes we say food scraps, sometimes we say food waste, organics. There's a variety of ways to communicate about this. And what would be really useful for practitioners is just to take a look at what terms are currently being used and what language is being used by practitioners to discuss this topic. So I conducted some research this semester. What I did was I put together a survey and I distributed the survey mainly through my professional networks. In the survey, I basically asked program administrators just to select what terms they use. So I have 4 main categories of terms to kind of break apart the organic materials. And in total, there are 22 terms to select from, and practitioners could pick and choose as many as they wanted. They also had an option to write in additional terms, but I didn't have anyone write in any additional terms. Then I ended up getting 50 responses for my survey, which I was pretty pleased with. As expected, most of these responses were from the West Coast states, so California, Oregon, Washington, and Colorado. I did get a few responses from other states, which I was excited about. And I also got one response from a small jurisdiction in Ontario, Canada, which was very cool. So I think this distribution is twofold, mainly because of my professional connections, but also there's a lot of programs in these states as well. So this is a snapshot of my findings. I've parsed out the data to have one chart here. This chart is just looking at residential curbside programs and the terms that are used. So this means curbside programs, so the rolling cart that you have, and these programs that collect yard debris, food scraps, and food toilet paper. And as you can see, there's not really one term that is used or a primary term. We have some leaders, organics being one, food and yard waste as another, food waste being a big one. But across the board, a lot of these terms are being used. On average, jurisdictions selected 11 out of the 22 terms, which I thought was really interesting. To me, this indicates that a lot of these terms are used interchangeably. I understand there are some, I don't have the context for every term, in every scenario being used, but I want to point out that just because these terms are used interchangeably or they're similar terms, they're not necessarily synonymous. And that could lead to program confusion and perhaps lack of adoption in these curbside programs. So I'll close out tonight with some recommendations. So the first recommendation I have is to develop an organics recycling program language. So this means getting with your staff. You can use my chart that I provided and just pretty much pick a term, pick 1 or 2 terms, for each of the materials that you're describing. Stick with those terms, be consistent, and really vet your materials that you're using. I also want to note it's important to be technically correct. As I mentioned, some of these terms are similar, but they're not synonymous. One thing I see quite often is calling the curbside collection container a compost bin or asking folks to put their compost in that bin. And to me, that's a little bit confusing because that bin is not doing any composting. It's just a collection container that sits on your curb. You're not putting compost in there. I want compost for my garden. I'm not giving that away. Instead, I'm giving you my food scraps in my lawn debris and my lawn materials. My next suggestion is to, I call it avoid the W word, avoid the word waste. And I put that in quotes because I got a really kind email from a program administrator who told me that he banned the W word in all of their communications. And this is twofold. He was speaking to talking about food waste and wasted food. And he said the waste word can be accusatory. People have been taught to not waste food, and there's some moral and psychological connotations with that word. But to me, I think also talking about this material that we're collecting as waste kind of goes against the ethos of a lot of these programs. This material is a really valuable resource to turn into compost, which is a soil amendment. And yeah, it's just a good resource. So I've also been trying to not say the word waste as much as possible this evening. In my last 3 suggestions, these are based in a literature review that I did, as well as which included academic sources as well as administrative best practices. So norming, that's a term that comes from community-based social marketing, which is an approach to elicit behavior change. And a norm message is just making something normal. It's not novel. I'm not saying, oh, this is new. This is just something that we do. But in order to create a norm message, you need to be speaking the common language. Lastly, almost lastly, but develop a regional approach. So community members interact with the solid waste system at a regional level, not necessarily a jurisdictional level. So my suggestion is, if possible, if there are similarities between jurisdictions with close borders. Harmonizing outreach material, talking in the same terminology could be really helpful for folks in the region. And lastly, considering color, images, and languages. There are other forms to communicate outside of just the written word. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to include color or image elements of program materials, although they're very, very important. I was able to ask about languages, and out of the 50 responses, over 20 of the jurisdictions said that they include outreach material in multiple languages. So I thought that was a really interesting finding. And with that, I'll close out. Thank you, and take a question.
Awesome work, Sarah. Really, really cool, kind of fascinating findings there. I guess one thing I noticed in your sort of word cloud of like most commonly used terms that I was a little surprised by was like the word climate was so low, or like words I would associate of like the why or the reasoning behind like why we're doing this. I feel like with the blue bin, like with the recycle bin, people kind of have a stronger intuition of like, yeah, this is good, like why we're doing this. And there's been like decades of messaging to like reinforce that. But I could see there being a disconnect of someone being told like, now I got to throw my food in this other bin, being like, why? Right. So I don't know if that's like a real trend you think you're seeing, or if people are grappling with that, or like how to strengthen that messaging, because that may increase buy-in,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the climate messaging is something practitioners kind of go back and forth about, depending on the political environment and like how appetizing is that conversation. Also in the community-based social marketing research, which is how do you sustainably change behavior, informational messages oftentimes are not the most convincing to behavior change. So if you just give people a stats, like I started with earlier, I did start with an informational message about methane and its problems, but successful programs use a norming message. So it's just like Sacramento County, puts food scraps in the bin. Like that's what we do, like using that message, and also including supportive infrastructure. So that's making sure everyone has curbside carts. Those two programmatic elements are shown to have, result in behavior change.
So similar to what you were saying about avoiding the W word, are there certain terms that are more effective than others to convey to the public? Or like I know you surveyed based on frequency, but do you have a sense of effectiveness of the words used as well?
That's a great question. I don't know. So I don't know that I would love to survey, residents, about outreach material and just say like, does this make sense to you? What is convincing? What is compelling? That I haven't had the resources to do that. I would love to, and I also didn't find any information about that. That being said, I would recommend kind of the process of simplifying the language and just, if we can teach people what the term means and then continually use that term and continue to expose them to that term, I think that will be effective.
Hi, thank you for that fascinating presentation. I'm actually going to build on these questions because I'm thinking about recycling, right? And some evidence that when you do single streaming, you increase participation, but you decrease accuracy, right? In between those, and when you split stream, you increase accuracy, but you decrease compliance overall because people get sort of confused about what to put in what. And I'm wondering if there's a sense of in the organics space, whether part of this, I don't know if it's resistance or increasing this behavior change has to do with people not knowing or understanding what they're supposed to put in, or any fear about contaminating the compost.
Absolutely. That's a great question. I do address the contamination issue in my paper. It is a problem, and it's there. I see multiple approaches to dealing with contamination. Like you said, the split containers, which results in basically less diversion because you are asking someone to separate out their materials versus a single collection, which, you know, makes it really easy to recycle everything. But yeah, so anyways, I guess to your point about contamination, yeah, I think that speaks to just the simplification of language. Contamination is really complicated. You can bring in the producers of the material and, you know, packaging information, you know, there's the mislabeling of recyclable materials, compostable plastics, like it's a whole bucket. So it's fairly difficult to address from like a simple, you know, communication message, just because contamination comes from so many areas. And yes, part of it is not knowing, part of it is a confusing message. You know, if someone looks on the container that their, you know, salad came in or whatever, and it says it's recyclable, they're not going to check the municipal recycling guide. You know, they'll just toss it in. So yeah, it's super. I don't have a great answer to your question, but it's definitely a challenge. And the compost stream, since we are using it as a soil amendment, it is especially sensitive to contamination.
Okay.
Sorry, you didn't expect this to
Awesome presentation. As a fellow trash nerd, I really loved it. Did you have anyone that differentiated between what terms they use for, say, like a residential customer and like a commercial customer from the different streams, or was it mostly just geared towards like the residential sector?
Yeah, I did. So I did collect information about basically, yeah, collection sector as well as collection system. So whether it's the 1-cart or 2-cart system, generally I saw similar terminology from the commercial and from the residential side if they're doing the same collection program versus like a drop off or something like that.